In the high hazard process industries, we've entered a stable, low process incident frequency phase, effectively a post-war state. Can the impact of peacekeeping intervention following real war ceasefires provide any lessons to help us maintain the current status quo in process risk management? Does peacekeeping save lives? According to the research carried out by American academic Virginia Page Fortna, demonstrably so. In her book, Does Peacekeeping Work?, she analysed the chronology following Civil War ceasefires in the 1990s, where peacekeeping and peace enforcement missions were deployed in 36 cases, while not in the remaining 58. She discovered that if forces were deployed following conflict ceasefires, peacekeeping reduced the risk of another war by 55 to 60%. Before the implementation of successful peace-kept ceasefires, Mozambique, 1992-94, Sierra Leone, 1999-2006, Liberia, 2003 to 2018, there were more than 1 million conflict-related deaths, which equates to hundreds of thousands of future lives saved by post-conflict peacekeeping intervention. Although orders of magnitude less dangerous than civil wars associated with historic and ongoing peacekeeping efforts, process safety incidents in the high hazard processing industries, oil and gas production, chemicals, fertilizers, etc., have led to the preventable deaths of thousands of people over recent decades, including in 1984, the Bhopal disaster, in 1988, Piper Alpha, in 2005, Texas City refinery explosion, and in 2010, Deepwater Horizon. The second question that Fortna poses in her book is, if peacekeeping works, how does it do so? In this paper, I review some of the methods successfully applied to see if any could be mapped to the high hazard processing industries to help us maintain process safety momentum in a post-war context. The war on process risk started over 200 years ago. E.I. DuPont founded his eponymous company in 1802, setting up a gunpowder mill at Brandywine Creek in Delaware. The initial years of manufacture were relatively incident-free. However, a serious explosion occurred in 1818, resulting in 34 deaths. The company would have been bankrupt if a supplier had not agreed to accept payment later than originally agreed upon, allowing the mills to be rebuilt over the following year. The accident was investigated, conclusions drawn, and new safety measures put in place, including mill workers had to wear boots held together with wooden pegs instead of iron nails. A narrow gauge railway connecting the various buildings at the plant site not only ran on hydropower, but was also meticulously crafted on wooden tracks. Cooling fans in the machine repair shop had blades of lacquered leather, and DuPont preferred to hire inexperienced workers and train them in the rules and procedures. And these measures were successful. 2 years later, there was another explosion, and as DuPont noted in his journal, nobody was injured, and it's proved a fair experiment that upon the plan on which our mills are now built, we have not to fear any general explosion like the one which happened 2 years ago. The struggle against process risks had begun. ICI, a major UK-based chemicals manufacturer, which was a significant industrial force in the latter half of the 20th century, started in the 1950s to build and operate facilities which were larger and contained more hazards. Accordingly, when losses of that containment occurred, they did so with increasing impact. Indeed, the fatal accident frequency among workers doubled in the 8 years from 1960. Something had to be done, and it was. HAZOP was preferred to inherently safer design as it was easier, cheaper, to apply at a lower organizational level and therefore more likely to be adopted. And it worked. Within 12 years, the FAR had been reduced by over 70%, meaning that ICI's implementation of HAZOP and other supporting techniques saved around 50 future lives. In the subsequent decades of the 20th century, process safety was further enhanced by the development and implementation of quantitative techniques such as SIL and LOPA, and legal paradigms such as ALARP. Process hazards were increasingly corralled and contained, to the extent that largely, I would argue, the war against process risks has been won. Incident rates are at a historic low and have plateaued, which is a good thing. However, as we tend to overestimate the likelihood of an event recurring when it has just happened, but progressively underestimate it as time passes, there is a risk that the infrequency of incidents correlates to complacency and transgression. According to its own website, UN peacekeeping helps countries navigate the difficult path from conflict to peace. The United Nations was founded in 1948, and by 2018 there were around 105,000 people serving in the UN peacekeeping operations. It has a budget of around $8 billion and as of January 2022 was active in 15 locations worldwide. Are there sufficient similarities between the belligerents in a civil war and the stakeholders and hazards in a high hazard processing operation? Let's consider the belligerent characteristics of process hazards. Pressurized, flammable, and toxic hydrocarbons. Size and strength matter. Insufficiency of intelligence about hazards becoming consequences. Predictable response to loss of containment. Like rebels in a peace-kept conflict, hazards are often undetectable when they are contained. So, overlap in several areas. Enough, I believe, to merit further investigation. Ms. Fortna describes 4 types of peacekeeping: observation, interpositional, multidimensional, peace enforcement. Another category which I identified separately is transition assistance. Let's consider each type and see if there are any useful process risk mappings. Observation missions consist of small contingents of military or civilian observers tasked with monitoring ceasefires, troop withdrawals, or other conditions outlined in the ceasefire agreement. They are typically unarmed and are primarily tasked with observing and reporting what is taking place. Ms. Fortna argues that observation encourages compliance. It does this by increasing trust between the parties and gives frontline soldiers confidence that the other protagonists in the conflict are respecting the agreement. I believe that there are useful parallels in the high hazard processing industries. RasGas, the Qatari LNG producer, which was recently absorbed into Qatargas, run an operator care program where operators are supported to act as owners of the equipment for which they are responsible. A key element of this program is senior management encouragement of frontline decisions to stop production if they sense that things are not right. Another mapping of process risk observational success is the 2016 HSE audit of Ely. At the start of 2016, Ely, the world's premier manufacturer of sports bullets, received a visit from an HSE inspector, who subsequently advised them to undertake a HAZOP of their process before he returned later in the year. Accordingly, they looked for a HAZOP course and subsequently enrolled on one I was presenting on behalf of the ICME in March 2016. At the end of the course, we agreed I would set up and facilitate an initial HAZOP for them, which they would use as a template for the rest of their facility. Fast forward to today, Ely have completed all the HAZOPs for their chemical processes. They have developed a program to cyclically revisit the program. They are delighted. They are fully committed to their new relationship. This type of operation is conducted as a means of keeping two opposing military forces apart in the aftermath of hostilities while negotiations for a peace agreement are in progress. For me, this is the equivalent to the processes we go through to determine the type and strength of barriers between hazard and consequence. As Ms. Fortna states in her book, today's multidimensional peacekeeping operations are called upon not only to maintain peace and security, but also to facilitate the political process, protect citizens, and many other important tasks. Similarly, in process safety, too much emphasis on one single element, e.g. HAZOP, can generate misplaced confidence. Peace enforcement refers to the use of military assets to enforce a peace against the will of the parties to a conflict when, for instance, a ceasefire has failed. Peace enforcement often exceeds the capacity of peacekeeping forces and is thus better executed by more heavily armed forces. A peace enforcement process mapping is perhaps BP's actions following the Deepwater Horizon disaster. Deepwater Horizon cost BP $50 billion and its CEO at the time instigated measures to address the root cause of the incident. BP's training and development programs enhanced the capability of their staff at all levels to deliver safe, reliable, responsible and efficient operations. The BP Global Safety and Operations Audit Team, working independently of the operating sites, assesses the site against predefined protocols. And finally, the recommendation of the Bly report, which required hazard and operability (HAZOP) reviews for surface gas and drilling fluid systems for all BP owned and BP contracted drilling rigs. This was implemented by 2013 and anecdotally enabled me to become a HAZOP chair in 2011 with little previous experience. This type of operation is initiated to support the transition of a country to peaceful conditions and an acceptable political structure after a civil conflict or struggle for independence or autonomy. The peacekeeping force attempts to effect an end to violence, foster an environment in which the achievement of a negotiated settlement by all parties in conflict. The nature of the risks in HHPIs is never constant. Although the key sectors therein are relatively mature, technology develops. For example, increased automation, hardware and software, with the associated risk of latent failures, cyber attacks, man-machine interface evolution. Furthermore, new HPI sectors are created, as they were when Bayer upscaled the Haber process for ammonia generation a century ago. New sectors include nanotechnology and additive manufacture, an example of which is direct metal laser sintering, or DMLS, which uses lasers to melt and fuse metallic powders to rapidly and efficiently create complex 3D industrial parts. The hazards associated with this new industry include dispersion of metal powders, potential carcinogens, exposure to argon, asphyxiation, electrostatic discharges, potential for metal dust explosion, and laser radiation. In the presence of strong cultural and psychological forces, corporate towards efficiency, individual towards least effort, human behaviour is likely to migrate towards the boundary of acceptable performance. When the hazards are new or unknown, it is therefore imperative to quickly understand and mitigate them before this boundary is breached, leading to an accident. Accordingly, appropriate safeguards need to be conceived and provided as these new hazards are identified, rather than in response to major incidents and their associated fatalities, which has been the standard chronology since DuPont's day. It is perhaps instructive at this stage to see what we can learn from notable successes and failures of UN peacekeeping in recent years. Liberia, the first independent country in Africa, enjoyed nearly a century and a half of stability before falling into chaos, enduring two devastating civil wars between 1989 and 2003. More than 250,000 Liberians were killed and nearly a third of the population was uprooted. Some 16,000 personnel from more than a dozen countries served as UN peacekeepers. Their service did not come without sacrifice. 200 peacekeepers lost their lives due to illness, accidents, or other causes while serving in Liberia. However, despite these tremendous achievements, the world press isn't generally excited enough to report because they judge that the readership probably won't be excited enough, or an absence of killing. This is perhaps akin to our industry, where success we have had in reducing process safety incidents seems to be inversely proportional to the press coverage. In Somalia, the UN operation was the first time peacekeeping force had been used for humanitarian intervention. However, the peacekeepers were met with a hostile reception in Mogadishu. Several of them were killed, and the bodies of dead US soldiers were paraded through the streets on the orders of Somali warlords. In both these cases, there is a significant press coverage, mostly due to their judgment that the readership, you and me, will be excited by the associated violence, death and destruction. Psychological reaction to fear and excitement is very similar. In fact, high-grossing films were made about some of these scenarios. Somalia, Black Hawk Down receipts $170 million. BP Gulf of Mexico disaster, Deepwater Horizon receipts $139 million. So how did the UN respond to these disastrous interventions? Lessons were learned and put into practice in future missions. Following Srebrenica, a new mission category, peace enforcement, was agreed. Being flexible about determining the right size and character of the mission as it progressed, and emphasizing the commitment to maintain and sustain support over the long term. Ms. Fortner argues that peacekeepers can have a causal rather than spurious effect on the stability of peace if they, 1, raise the costs of war or the benefits of peace for the peace-kept, 2, disrupt spirals of fear by increasing certainty about all parties' actions and intentions, 3, prevent accidents from occurring or control them so that they do not escalate, and 4, can deter or prevent either side from reneging on deals. I believe there are important ideas which flow from these tenets which could help 21st century process safety. Mapping to process risk intervention, we can leverage this finding by emphasizing the financial benefits of determining operators' optimal process safety return on investment. Include the benefits of improved uptime, psychologically more positive, and personalizing future lives saved. The opposite of the unknown soldier, a designated survivor. Ops get to vote for a process safety champion when one future life is saved. Bonus recognition. Fortner found that UN observers were necessary because you needed people to track movement, to do head counts of demobilizing troops and so on. One example involved the UN's monitoring of elite troops the government hid in the Presidential Guard, part of the police force. A protagonist asked the UN police forces to do surprise inspections of the Presidential Guard. The government was furious, but there were suspicions that demobbed soldiers were secretly being transferred to the Presidential Guard and trained in violation of the Accords. In this case, process safety intervention might mean doing the same thing with communicated but unplanned audits. These surprise visits could be explained in terms of reflecting human nature. This is what we're all prone to, rather than lack of trust in workers, and be spread evenly across the company hierarchy. Fortner reported that the cooperation of the Renamo leadership in the Mozambique Civil War was more direct, involving cold hard cash. The UN bought cooperation with millions of dollars in a trust fund nominally set up to help Renamo transform itself into a political party. According to one report, when a UN official offered Daklama a check for the first installment, he refused, saying he wanted it in cash. An international observer of the peace process put it this way: payments to Daklama helped keep him in power. He needed patronage to dole out, otherwise he would have been dead, literally. Here, process risk intervention could be zero tolerance of fugitive emissions, with an operations bonus linked to numbers decrease, being willing to set a default bar in case of large-scale emissions in any one year. Also, funds need to be spent wisely and not necessarily logically or morally. You may have to do things which make you corporately uncomfortable, and then make sure you report on improvements or be willing to change course if the intervention proves unproductive. Ms. Fortner has stated the importance of preventing agreement reneging. One equivalent in our industry is ensuring that agreed HAZOP actions are implemented. There are numerous examples of non-implementation becoming contributory causes to process safety disasters. For example, an LAHH trip at the distillation column in Texas City. 2013, I was contracted to close out hazard actions for an early production facility in Iraq. I triaged the actions such that all the red items, immediate risk of fatality, were closed out ahead of startup. With some considerable effort and cooperation, this was achieved. Process hazards and fundamental human nature are impervious to process risk intervention. However, organizational culture, structure, design philosophy, informing the basis of design may not be. This may be easier to achieve when high hazard processing companies are privately or nationally owned, where the ultimate owner, a few individuals or a few politicians, are likely to be more engaged with any major process safety incident than those of a PLC, multitudinous individuals and organizations. One example of a high hazard processing company with few individual owners is INEOS. Founded by Jim Radcliffe in 1999 with the purchase of a small Belgian company, Inspec, it has grown to become a behemoth, recognizing the existential impact a process safety disaster could have on his business. Take the example of Union Carbide, owner of Bhopal plant, disappeared when absorbed into Dow Chemicals. He and his fellow owners take a frequent and forensic position on this issue. Peacekeeping is not free and can only be sustained when intervention success is apparent. I believe that UN intervention in recent civil wars is an imperfect but useful metaphor for the current state of process safety in the high hazard processing industries. There are several things we can learn from mapping relevant findings from the former to optimization for the latter and linking them to a new putative intervention tools. 1. We can communicate and carry out unplanned audits which, when they occur, are well publicised in a balanced way, or perhaps implement an operator care programme. 2. We could invest in industry incident databases such as Fiorda for the fertiliser industry. 3. Perhaps recognise and respond to the potential correlation between the number and engagement of operating company stakeholders and process risk outcomes. 4. Where the war on process safety risks, regions, industries is still smouldering, focus resources there. 5. Novel HHPI risks will not necessarily respond predictably to existing process risk barriers. 6. Accentuate the positive, personalising future lives saved, opposite of the unknown soldier, designated survivor. 7. Zero tolerance for fugitive emissions, with an operations bonus linked to numbers decrease. And 8. HSE in the UK and a possible model for other countries and regions. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me.